Cool. Well, listen, it's 7:03 and we've got about 50 people in the room here. So I'm gonna kick things off and just take it from the top, I guess, and say thanks to everybody who's out there who's participating tonight. We've got with us Joon Lee, sports writer for ESPN, and Andrew Destin and Preston Shoemaker are here to help me out, asking some questions. And kind of just to set things up a little bit for June, we've got students from some different places in our classes. Some of the students are just here out of interest. Some are part of a class I'm doing on sports media and society. And we're talking about sort of cultural issues in sports. And some of them are in sports writing. Andrew and Preston are this semester. So we're going to just kind of talk about a whole bunch of things and just go. For everybody out here who's here, just a little bit of June's background. As we've been talking, he's from the Boston area, from Brookline. And he graduated from Cornell in 2017, so not much older than you guys, and has had internships at Globe and our Boston Herald and the Washington Post, and has written for The Ringer, and he had a position at Bleacher Report and then moved over to ESPN. So already accomplished a lot in a short period of time. And I'm gonna jump into a story in particular that we wanted to talk about, but I did want to take 1 minute because we were talking earlier, and it's a little bit of a sad, not a little bit, it's a sad day in sports journalism today, with the passing yesterday of Pedro Gomez, who is a reporter for ESPN, who did a lot of baseball work, was at Penn State a few times for our recruiting day, met with me, had appeared at awesome conventions, and spoke to the women in sports journalism. And so was a really well-loved figure, and June also knew Pedro. So I just kind of wanted to ask you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a surprise and a shock at the end of the Super Bowl yesterday. I got a text message from one of my friends who was just like, "Hey, did you see this?" And I was like, "Is this real?" Like it was just like something that like didn't even register as something that was plausible when I got the link. And I didn't know Pedro that well. I have plenty of colleagues, and I think you've seen tributes today over on Twitter and on television about how much Pedro meant to so many different people. But the thing that always stood out to me, just being around Pedro over the years as just a reporter and having been his colleague for 2 years, was just how warm and kind and generous he was with his time, just at the ballpark, with people all around the game, with people in journalism. And for me, Pedro was someone who I looked up to as a role model for a really long time. I remember watching him cover Barry Bonds in the home run chase in the 2000s, and how he was basically on SportsCenter like every single day talking about Barry Bonds. And I remember meeting Pedro for the first time at Fenway Park when I was an intern in high school at the Boston Herald, and I had one of my mentors, Steve Buckley, introduce me to Pedro, and they'd known each other for such a long time. And I remember even back then that Pedro was just so generous, and he's one of those people that when you talk to him, he really made you feel like the most important person in the world, because he just gave you his full undivided attention. And I think I think especially in sports media, you'll meet a lot of different people of different personality types. There are people who are very ambitious and will kind of only look out for themselves, and kind of try to always just trying to put themselves in the best position possible to succeed. And Pedro is not one of those people. He was one of those people who's just so generous with his time, and touched so many people, and was just treated everyone equally. And I think as also as just a minority in sports writing and sports media, I think he kind of set a role model for so many people. He broke the barriers for so many different people. I was talking to, or I was seeing just the tributes today online. One of my colleagues, Alden Gonzalez, he grew up in the same neighborhood in Miami as Pedro did, and just seeing how much Pedro meant to someone like him was really heartbreaking and also touching. But I think the thing that I've learned at this point in my career is that spending about 8 years or so in the sports media business, is that I've seen the people at the top are either like really, really, really great people who are just some of the nicest people that you'll meet, and there's the kind of opposite, is that you'll meet some pretty awful people at the top of sports media and just media in general, people who are really ambitious and careerist. And I think Pedro is one of those examples of the people who just was so generous with so many different people. And I think you can just see through the earnestness of so many of the tributes that have come out online today about just kind of how special he was to so many different people, and just the range of people that he meant a lot to. So it's just a heartbreaking day. I mean, he's 58 years old, and it's just especially amidst the pandemic where there's been so much sadness. It felt really, really tough to hear that news yesterday.
Well, I guess all we can do tonight is sort of get on with it and ask you some questions and talk about your work and your rising star. The first thing I wanted, before we sort of get into your path and all that sort of biographical stuff, I wanted to jump right into a story that both classes that I teach had been asked to read, and it is a really interesting piece that you mentioned just in passing to me when we were talking ahead of time, that you've been working on this for a couple of years, and it's the story about Instagram being sort of the new video mixtape for people who want to become basketball prospects at the college level. And I'm wondering if you can describe the story a little bit and tell us the story of the story. How did it become so interesting to you? How did you build it?
Sure. Yeah. I would honestly have to part of the credit goes to my cousin who lives out in LA and is just like a insane sports nut. And at the time that I was starting to report out this story, which I think was 2018, maybe late 2018, I'd been visiting my cousin out in LA. He was just telling me how crazy the high school basketball scene had gone in LA, because one of his neighbors was the coach for Crossroads High School, which is where Bronny James was briefly enrolled before he transferred over to Sierra Canyon. He was one of the assistant coaches over there. And, I remember we were just sitting around like dinner one night, and we were talking about just sports and just generally the high school scene. And he was just talking about how when he would go to those games, he would just see everyone pointing their cameras, their smartphone cameras at the court. And, at that point I was working at Bleacher Report, and I'd worked with Omar Raja, who ran Has the Highlights, and had kind of made a lot of these high school stars, internet stars. I saw him through House of Highlights. Like, he saw Mac McClung dunk on the internet and then reposted the clips multiple times over the course of the summer. And Mac McClung, I saw him literally go from someone who nobody knew about to someone with hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers because of House of Highlights. And so I was kind of at this perfect inflection point in between, as someone who was kind of distanced away from the basketball scene, as someone who didn't kind of cover basketball on a day-to-day basis, but also someone who was at Bleacher Report, where I kind of saw the effect of virality on how kind of sports media was being shaped and how it was affecting the culture of the sport. It was something that always struck me as interesting, just because I've always been someone who's loved the internet, dating back to high school. Like, I had a Twitter account in in eighth grade, which was like 2008 or 2009 or something. I had a YouTube channel in high school where I didn't do anything related to sports. Like, I covered consumer technology, where I like reviewed iPhone cases and headphones. And so I've always just like really loved the internet and have been fascinated by how it shapes culture. It shapes the way that people think. And how it is, I often feel like we're the guinea pigs of the internet generation, because, we're figuring out so many different things from a politics, government standpoint about how to regulate the internet and how it's continuing to change our lives. Because, I talked to my dad all the time about this, about how, you know, when he was in college, he bought an encyclopedia set, and we still have it over there. And I have never opened it before because Wikipedia exists. And like, that's such a different information dynamic that has just changed the way that we all think about people and culture and all that stuff. And so I was interested in covering Crossroads High School initially. The story was initially about Crossroads High School when it was assigned to me at Bleacher Report, because Sharif O'Neal, who was the son of Shaq, had become an internet star. And so I went over to Crossroads High School, and I immediately saw that the story was bigger than Crossroads High School. Like, it was a story about the internet and how it was affecting high school basketball. Because when I had the conversations with these kids, I embedded with Crossroads High School for a week, and the story never ended up manifesting itself at Bleacher Report. But when I would talk to these kids, the first thing they wanted to talk about was Instagram and how it's the highlights and how it was affecting the culture of the sport. So I basically just kept talking to these kids about how the game was being changed by the presence of cameras there, and how over the course of a couple of years, because of the proliferation of smartphone cameras, the fact that kind of these fancy cameras to shoot video have gotten so much more accessible, it was a lot easier for people to just kind of come into a high school gym and shoot these kids and make them internet stars. And literally every single one of them, to a T, there is not one high school basketball player I talked to. I talked to a lot of high school basketball players for this story that said that they didn't think about the fact that cameras were there. And these are high schoolers. And so, high schoolers, as much as I would have wanted to think in high school that I was like a fully formed adult, I definitely wasn't. And it was a lot harder to kind of compartmentalize different parts of my life. And I could just tell when I would talk honestly with these kids that, as much as they wanted to think that the cameras didn't affect them, on a subconscious level, they literally to a T all admitted that it did. And so I was interested in kind of figuring out why that was happening, and what kind of the motivations were behind these people, and how these kids who were kind of mediocre high school basketball players, maybe 3 or 4 star prospects, were getting hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers, because that fame dynamic was just so different from the one that I witnessed as a high schooler watching the high school basketball scene. Like, the only high school basketball players that I had heard of, kind of early on in high school, were like Jabari Parker and Andrew Wiggins. And that's because that they were nationally covered, because there were these like huge prospects. And it was shocking to me to like see a kid on the basketball court who I had never heard of, who wasn't a notable, going to the NBA type of prospect, who was a 3-4 star prospect, and realizing that he was internet famous, and how kind of the internet famed kind of shaped these kids as well. Because like, when you're in high school, it's so much easier to just kind of be in your internet bubble and realize and think that like 300,000 followers is a lot of followers, but also like, my mom doesn't know who this 3-star basketball prospect is, right? Like, at the end of the day, like, you're living in this kind of internet ecosystem. And so I was very fascinated just to see kind of how the business of high school basketball was intersecting with the internet, and how it was kind of intersecting with the culture. And at the center of it was LaMelo Ball and Bronny James, because they were kind of two of the biggest, real deal internet celebrity high school basketball celebrities of like the internet age.
Let me just ask a couple of quick follow-ups, and then I'll let Andrew and Preston jump in. And I should say, I forgot to earlier, if you want to ask a question in among the students who are out there, please just put it in chat. I'm watching it. We can pick up questions and read them off. So please jump in. But I'm curious. I'm actually fascinated by how you think that realization of understanding, hundreds of thousands of people are watching you essentially every time you play, your crosstown rival, affects the athletes and affects the game. And also, how is it affecting sports media in your view?
I think that's a really good question. I think on the court, it affects players because they chase the highlights. These players want views and they want followers, because that's a lot of these high school players think that that's what correlates to them having a brand and having a path to professional basketball, regardless of whether or not they actually have the skill set to do that. And so, I saw kids. One of the coaches for one of the high school teams I talked to literally said that one of the players asked out of a game because he didn't want to get embarrassed by being crossed over by someone on the opposing team and going viral on Instagram for the wrong reasons. That's like a genuine thing that happens now, which is crazy. And then on top of that, you see the way that the game on the floor changes. So, we've all seen an NBA game and how things go back and forth and how there's kind of a natural flow of things. If you watch a high school basketball game now, especially in populous areas with a big high school star, you'll see this really weird rhythm where kids are trying to cross really trying to cross people over dribbling, trying way too hard. So you'll see lots of really bad mistakes. You'll see kids go for dunks that they should not be going for. You'll see kids going for like really flashy passes that they shouldn't be going for. You'll see kids kind of leak out, not play defense because if they get a steal, their teammate can pass to them and like can get a breakaway dunk. Like it and when you watch these games, like the highlights don't correlate when you go on Instagram because you only when those are edited together, you only see the dunks, you only see the flashy plays, you only see the blocks. You don't see like all of the mistakes and all of the misses that come before then. So there's this dynamic where these players, I was talking to Mike Schmitz for the YouTube version of the story, and he mentioned that at one of these like big prospect showcases, there was a player who had a pretty bad showing in front of scouts. And then when he checked Twitter afterwards, someone had put together a highlight reel that made it look like he had a really good showcase. And then he was continuing to like hype himself up on social media. And Mike is like he's someone who's a basketball evaluator. He was like, this dude had an awful outing. All the scouts thought he was awful. But if you go on the internet, it's just a completely different narrative. It's kind of how, the social media accounts allow people to at least have a stronger voice in shaping their own narratives. And so you kind of see that kind of thing emerge. And it's people kind of live, we see this in sports and you see this in politics and you see this, within our own social circles, like people live out their own narratives now and they can get the validation to, regardless of whether or not it's based in truth, like they can find people to validate the reality that they're pushing out.
That's fascinating. Just real quick, Jack Kelly just comments, nobody ever wants to contest a dunk anymore because they're afraid of, presumably they're afraid of what's about to happen.
100%.
And Quinn Taylor asks a great question. Has this impacted sportsmanship? Kids hogging and being flashy, no longer being involved in teamwork?
I don't know if it's affected sportsmanship, but it's definitely affected team dynamics because I was sitting in a video meeting where the Crossroads team was just overlooking the video footage of the game the night before, and the subtext of everything, without having the coach having said anything, was stop leaking out and playing for the cameras. Like that's why you screwed up on this play. Mm-hmm. That was literally the subtext for the entire 1 hour video meeting. And so you'll see, like I went to the Hoop Hall showcase, and a lot of the best high school teams in the country, they play good team basketball. Like the teams that are like truly the top high school teams in the country, they play good team basketball, and there are players on these teams. I think an example of that was Jalen Green, at Prolific Prep. He played with Nomari Burnett and a handful of other really good high school players, and they played like a team. It was truly team basketball. But then you'll see other teams at these showcases where there's one star player, and it's clear that the guy's trying to do too much. And so at the end of the day, like good basketball players are going to kind of emerge from all of this, right? Like the best basketball players at the end of the day are the people who are going to make it to the NBA, regardless of whether or not like they have hundreds of thousands of followers. Because I remember Evan Mobley, who's like one of the top prospects in the high school basketball class. He had like 10,000 followers on Instagram because he's a 7-footer who plays a back to the basket game and doesn't put up highlights. And like, that's why he's not internet famous, but that doesn't mean he's not good at basketball. He's just not putting up the type of highlights that the internet loves. And so there's often this like dichotomy between the internet fame of someone and whether or not they're actually good. And a lot of these kids just aren't able to kind of discern between the two things. But my assumption is that a lot of the kids who are truly great are going to be able to manage all of that better. And I think someone like Bronny James is honestly someone who's doing that pretty well as a now high school sophomore.
Andrew, Preston.
I'll go, Andrew.
Go for
I
it.
have two questions, June, that kind of jumped right off the top of my head. I'll start with this one. I know you worked on that story for quite a long time. Can you talk a little bit about the time frame for that, just real quick? I believe it was 2 years, I think.
Yeah, so part of that was I changed jobs in the middle of that, and at Bleacher Report, the story was initially going to be just about Crossroads High School, and for a variety of reasons, the story kind of fell apart. But I thought the reporting was like the subject matter was too interesting to just like throw it all away, so I just kept it in my back pocket, and I spent maybe the first 6 or 7 months at ESPN just covering baseball and getting my feet under me, and then I was able to pitch it to the right editors at ESPN and get it back off the ground. And so, it was definitely a long reporting process. I've literally never done more reporting in my life on a story other than that one. So part of that was the time thing, but the other part was like I also changed jobs, which is why it took a really long time to get off the ground. But I've talked to reporters where that's kind of a regular thing where sometimes like you just have to sit on. I still have reporting that I've been sitting on for years for other stories. So I'm hoping that there's some stuff that will find the light of day at some point in the future. But sometimes stories just like the timeline for it, the timing just isn't right, or my goal with any reporting that I do is trying to make the biggest impact possible with the reporting that I have, and sometimes the timing just isn't right. So you just have to sit on it until the timing is right. So there's a level of this story taught me patience more than anything, because it was definitely really hard to sit on this, because I thought the substance of it was really interesting.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going with the question too. Just there are a lot of the people in this call, college students, college journalists. We've never worked on a story for that length of a time. So you talked a little bit there about the process of it, but is it discouraging when you have a story like that? You really want to get it out there. You want to tell this story, but you're waiting for the right time. You're waiting for the right thing. What's it like to go to bed for 2 straight years every night and not have a story like that out there that you're working on and just like trying to get that published?
It really fucking sucks. Just like to be totally, it really sucks because like, you just like, I think with any creative thing, you go through waves. And so there was times where like, I was sitting on it and was just like, is this even good anymore? Like it's like when you say a word so many times that starts to lose its meaning. Like I had stared at drafts of this story for such a long time where I was just like, does anyone even care about this? And so, it definitely got discouraging at times. And sometimes you deal with people who don't necessarily believe in the idea or don't even get it. And, I think I went through a lot of editors for this story just because I was changing companies and there was a whole variety of issues with it. But, there are editors who I had an editor who did not believe that the story was that interesting. And there's tension there and it just is hard to deal with sometimes. And I think for me, the story taught me a lot of things beyond just the reporting of it. It taught me to be patient. It taught me that having the right editor for a story can really, really make or break it, because if you have someone who believes in your idea, who understands where you're coming from, what your idea even means in the first place, they're going to help funnel your passion for that. But if you have someone who is constantly putting up roadblocks and doesn't quite understand the story, it makes it really, really hard to report the story, because then I don't have a budget to go out and report it. So this, for a variety of reasons, this was it was an up and down process. And I literally remember like maybe a week before it came out and we had like a publish day for it. This was during the pandemic. I think this was back in August, and I was walking around with my mom in my neighborhood, and I was just like, I think the story kind of sucks. And she was just like, what are you talking about? Like you've been working on it for such a long time. And, your editors have said that it's interesting. Like, what are you talking about? So I guess it's just kind of the insanity that like a creative project will drive you through. So it was definitely up and down.
Yeah. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah. there were a lot of observations I obviously had with the piece, which I got to tell you, I really, really enjoyed it as somebody who, like you talked about somebody like a LaMelo Ball, the Ball family. Like I was fortunate enough to go see them play when they were in high school because of that Instagram, because of that social media. That's why I was like so drawn into that. But with those players, the ones who kind of ride the success of other players' coattails, do you see that as like an ongoing situation like that will continue into the future, is these players riding off of the success of that 5-star guy or the one who blows up on Instagram? Is that the future of recruiting, like something like that?
100%. I think that's just true in life in general. Like it's just because I think, even without cameras before, like you always had people in any workplace riding off the coattails of other people in some shape or form. So I think that's something that's going to continue to happen. Like I talked to a kid, DJ Houston, who played with Sharif, and he had no recruiting. I think this was in the story, but he had no recruiting offers before. And then he played next to Sharif, and then he suddenly had a bunch of offers. And I think a couple of years into him playing at Western Michigan, he transferred to like a community college. And like, I don't know why he transferred right at the end of the day, but like he went from being no college is interested to people being interested, and the thing that changed was Sharif became an internet star, and the cause and correlation I think is pretty aligned there. And so at the end of the day, like I think you see this on YouTube too. Like you see people pop up next to big vlogging stars like David Dobrik and become famous off of that. Like, I think this is just a thing. This is just a human dynamic that I think happens and is going to continue to happen. I think the internet just exacerbates it. So.
Cool. And there was one style thing that I noticed in your story that I found really interesting and kind of appreciated, and I was hoping you could clarify maybe, was that instead of using the word said for everybody's quote, it ended up being says. I don't know if there was any reason behind that in particular, but it's been ingrained in us consistently. You always do comma, quote, said, but I don't know if you had a thought on that.
I've never had anyone ask me that question directly. I think it's just something that I've always done from a style standpoint when I'm writing features.
Okay.
Like if I'm writing a long form feature, I've almost always used says, but like I have a story coming out tomorrow, and it's like a 900-word mini feature about what baseball teams have done in the last calendar year with the like bobbleheads that they were supposed to give out and haven't been given out. There's 4 million bobbleheads that are apparently like in a storage room, and I use said for that because it's not like a. I think the separating line is probably like the ambition of the story. Like if I'm trying to do an ambitious story that tries to like really, that I like sit down and like I outline and I like really try to like do the storytelling thing, I guess like that's kind of been the differentiator. But that's a good question. I've never really thought that hard about it, but it's kind of always been I think that's kind of always been the delineation between using said or says.
Cool.
I think just based on my own experience, that's a great answer. It adds a sense of immediacy to a story that's kind of could sink under the weight of either the topic or the length or both. So I think that's something.
I think the immediacy thing is very accurate. I think that's a really good point.
We're getting just a ton of questions all over the place about the Instagram issue, all over the place. But I'm gonna ask you a few other things first, and then we can get back to it a little bit later. I do want to ask you about another story that I read of yours that I just thought was terrific, about Young Hoku, the Falcons kicker. I don't know if you want to just. I didn't assign it, so I don't know that everybody has seen it. So you might want to just describe his story and how you got onto it. And it's to me, it's kind of a classic inspirational sports story, but it's very 21st century at the same time. It's very now.
If you want to read that story, you can go to my Twitter profile. It's the pinned tweet. So let's see. So I'm a Korean American. I think that's pretty obvious I'm obviously not white, so I guess that's pretty obvious if you're watching the Zoom call. And so, there's not, as someone growing up in America, like I didn't have a ton of Korean American or just Asian American in general role models to look up to in the sports world. or just in the entertainment world as a whole. Like I didn't see a whole lot of people on television or in movies who looked like me. And so when Young Wei made the Chargers back 2 years ago, it was a really, really big deal because, I was born in Seoul, South Korea. And so to see another Korean American who was around my age, like making a football team, it was like, oh my God, this is something. Like, I can't believe there's an Asian American face, let alone a Korean American face in football. And so I remember, the Asian American community in sports is very, very small, and sports media is very small. So like I knew Jay Caspian Kang, who was an editor over at Grantland and writes for the New York Times. He just wrote a great feature about Stephen Yen in the New York Times Magazine that came out this past Sunday. He was a mentor of mine when I was coming up through college, and I met Mina Kimes through him. And Mina was only doing writing at that point when I first met her, and then I met Pablo because the three of them were all friends because they're basically a generation above me, and they were, three smart people who were writing about sports and cared about sports. And I remember just Asian sports Twitter, which is a very niche subsection of Twitter, getting very excited about Youngwei. And so I remember following him on social media and just generally rooting for him to succeed. And I wrote a piece at Bleacher Report when he made the Chargers I reported out a story without his cooperation, without even talking to him about his experience being an Asian football player and just being a Korean American and what that was like for him. So I talked to one of his teammates from college who was also Korean American. I talked to one of his classmates who introduced him to football who was Korean American. And after that story, I think Youngwei followed me on Instagram, and then he got cut from the Chargers a couple weeks later. And so, I remember I was sitting on Jay Kang's couch and we were watching the Chargers, and we were both really, really, really nervous for him because he had a bad couple. He had missed a game-winning kick, I think, or had a game-winning kick blocked in his first week. So he was already kind of on edge, and he missed a kick, and then he got cut, and we were just like completely dejected. And I don't think I was ever sure that I was going to see Youngwei again in a football uniform. But, given that he's just a Korean American in sports, like we just kind of kept up with each other on Instagram, and I DM'd him from time to time, and I could see that he was continuing to work towards it. So I was just like, I'll keep an eye on this if something happens. And then he made it back to the the Legion for American Football or something. He played for the Atlanta Dream, which is like, they lasted for like 6 weeks as a football league, and he was perfect. Got a ton of NFL tryouts, and it seemed like he was going to get another opportunity at some point. And then he got a practice squad invite from the Patriots and then got cut. And then the Falcons signed him, and then he lasted the rest of the 2019 season. And so at the end of the 2019 season, I was like, all right, if Youngwei makes the team again for the Falcons next year, I'm going to write a story. And I pitched, it was like one of the first stories I pitched to my editor who I worked with, Rachel Ulrich, who works with some of the best writers at ESPN, and worked with Wright Thompson. So I was just excited to like have the opportunity to work with her as just an editor because she was someone who had always been a pal, and I just wanted to like have the opportunity of working with an editor who really focuses on storytelling. So that was like a really fun experience. And so I was just pitching this Youngwei story because I thought it could be a really interesting piece at some point. And then I got through the baseball season, and I looked up, and Youngwei was the top point scorer in the NFL. So like this, I wanted to write the story even before that he had become kind of this social media phenomenon, and had become the top point scorer in the NFL for all of the wrong reasons, because the Falcons can't score a touchdown, and they were constantly needing field goals. So I had hit up Youngwei at the beginning of the season. I was like, hey man, like, would you be interested in doing a story after he made the Falcons? I was like, would you be interested in doing a story for ESPN? He was like, yes. And so I knew that I was going to have his cooperation this time around. And then I basically reported out the background, and it was really interesting. And honestly, like, this was probably one of the more fulfilling stories that I've written, because there's not that many Asian people at ESPN. And so, and I'm the only Korean American male at ESPN. I guess Gary Streisky is on air and does Snapchat, but he's half Korean, so it's also a little different. And also, I'm a writer, and he's mostly on air. And I love Gary; is one of my favorite people in the world. But it felt really fulfilling, because this felt like a story that literally only probably me or Mina could have written, because we have the Korean American background. And I remember getting on the phone call with Young Wei for the interview after I'd done a ton of background. And it was just like, oh, we like came from very similar cultural backgrounds. We were both born in Korea and we both had Korean parents. And there were just like a lot of implicit cultural things that I just understood about his upbringing that, like, you know, frankly speaking, like a white or a black reporter just like would not, or a Hispanic reporter would just not be able to understand. And so I remember when that story went up, it was just like a very fulfilling thing, because one of my like big picture goals in pursuing this career in the first place was to write the stories of minorities, especially in the baseball world, because baseball writers are predominantly white. I felt like a lot of minorities had been kind of undercovered, and did not have kind of their true personalities kind of brought to the surface in an authentic way. And this being able to write Young Wei's story from the perspective of a Korean American, and also being able to write about what that means to Korean Americans, and Asian Americans as a whole, it felt like an incredibly fulfilling experience, and was just it felt like doing that kind of story was the reason I wanted to pursue sports writing in the first place, because I was able to tell the story of someone who I know that if I was a kid, or if I think about my nephews and my nieces who are, you know, growing up today and they're 2-3 years old, like that's the kind of story that I know that they would want to read one day. And so to be put in a position to tell those stories in an authentic way, was in kind of an uncompromising, like, this is what it's like to be Korean American kind of way, was incredibly fulfilling, and something that I was just so glad to have that experience.
Well, it's certainly an awesome read that I would highly recommend to anybody. You kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to say more generally. I don't know how to ask this question without it sounding like I'm answering it. Do you feel like Asian Americans get short shrift in sports media coverage, generally speaking, with a relative paucity of Asian American journalists in the business, and do you have thoughts about ways to change that?
So I could answer this specifically. So I guess to specifically talk about Asian Americans, I guess when you think about it, where Asian Americans fall within kind of the racial landscape of America, I think just generally, like, Asian American stories are undertold. And I think we're seeing that dynamic shift a little bit over the last couple of years. Like, if you just look at the movies that have come out, you know, Crazy Rich Asians was this huge Hollywood blockbuster, but as an Asian American myself, I wouldn't say that that was like an authentic Asian American cultural movie. It was like a huge Hollywood blockbuster. Like, at the end of the day, like, I can't relate to the really rich Asian people in that movie. Like, it's not an authentic capture of what it's like to be Asian American. But you kind of move forward beyond that, you know, you see The Farewell come out, which stars Awkwafina, and that was a movie that was half in Chinese and half in English, and was shot between China and the United States. And there's a movie coming out. I mentioned the Jay Kang story about Stephen Yen, but Minari, that's coming out from A24. That's a story about a Korean family who moves to Nebraska to start a farm, and it's like this Asian American immigrant story. And I watched that. I was lucky enough to see a preview of that movie, and it's coming out, and I would highly recommend all of you guys to go watch it. It's just this incredibly authentic story of what it's like to move to this country as a Korean American specifically, with all the kind of the embedded cultural things. And so there was like a level of intimacy and a slight level of uncomfortability in just how much I resonated with it, even though it was a story that was, you know, a couple generations above mine. Like, I know that people older than me probably resonated with that story more than I did, but for me, I've kind of seen this progression, kind of the authenticity of these Asian American stories becoming greater and greater. And even beyond just the movies, like the fact that BTS is like the biggest boy band in the world is such a mind-blowing thing to me, because, you know, when I was growing up, you never saw Asian Americans in any media. And so to see a Korean American group like put up on a pedestal by the Western media in the way that BTS is, it's such like a paradigm shifting experience, because, like, you know, my nieces and nephews and my sister or whatever, who's a senior in high school, like, they've grown up in a time where, like, they could plausibly imagine becoming a boy band or a girl band star and like becoming famous in America. Not that like you should aspire to that or whatever, but like you could plausibly imagine that. When I was growing up, that was not a thing that I ever imagined could possibly have been a thing. So just in that way, I think that the paradigm has kind of shifted. And I think Asian Americans are starting to find a bit of a voice in this country, and speaking out and being able to tell our stories authentically. I think from a bigger picture standpoint, just the reality is that sports media specifically is predominantly white men. And as much as many of my friends are white men, like white men have their limitations as we all do. And you know, I often like one thing that I noticed when I was in high school in the Red Sox clubhouse was that like the players who got the media attention happened to be predominantly white. And the Red Sox media core, as much as I love a lot of those people, like were predominantly white. And I saw a direct correlation between those two things because like I could see that a lot of these older white men did not know how to talk to like a black dude from the South. Like when I was in the Red Sox clubhouse, like it was like someone like Mookie Betts, for example, is a black dude from Nashville, Tennessee. A 50-year-old white man who spent his entire life on the East Coast is going to have a much harder time like relating to them on like a cultural, like I could talk to Mookie about like hip hop. Like I remember talking to him about Chance the Rapper or whatever in like 2015, you know, like there's like a 50-year-old white man is not going to be able to do that. And so something that I recognized was I had an opportunity as a minority to tap into these stories that weren't being told because of the different perspective I brought as a minority in this country. And so I think just generally as a whole, there's a gap in authentic storytellings, stories for minorities, and also women, by the way, because of the predominantly white male demographic of sports writing.
That's a fantastic answer, June. I kind of want to turn. We have just blown through this hour. It's 7:45, and I kind of want to turn toward your writing a little bit more, just in terms of technique. You've got a baseball focus, but you're a little bit of a jack of all trades at ESPN, and so I just kind of want to get you to talk a little bit to our students who are trying writing or trying sports journalism about the attitude you bring to, like, you know, your story about the start of the MLB season versus the bobblehead story. And then I'm going to let Andrew and Preston jump in, and we've got some questions on this general topic in chat. So off you go.
I think something I generally think about, especially with feature stories, is I always have specific people in mind when I'm writing about a story. So I would say for the majority of the feature stories that I write, my purpose is, yes, to capture like the sports interested person, people who are in this classroom right now who already know a lot about sports, but also to try to cross over and get people who wouldn't normally read a sports story to be interested in a sports story. So the two people that I always think about is one of my best friends from college, who she knows nothing about sports, but is a writer. And so I'm always interested in trying to get her to get interested in the story and trying to find an angle that gets her interested. And I think about my mom, because my mom doesn't care about sports. My mom also doesn't care about sports at all. Is an immigrant in this country, that's her English is her second language. And so those are the two people that I often think about when I'm trying to write a general sports feature, because you know, I know that if I can make the story appeal to those people, it will also appeal to the hardcore sports fan. In regards to just like the day-to-day stuff, covering baseball, I think about my friends who are like hardcore baseball fans. I think about what I would have wanted to read as like a high schooler. Like, what is the sports story that I would have been interested in? Like the way that I often come up with angles for sports stories is like, I just want to answer a question. So like the reason I came up with this bobblehead story idea, for example, is like, I love bobbleheads. And I literally just asked the question to my editor, like, what did these teams do with bobbleheads? And then we turned that into a story. So like a lot of truly like coming up with a lot of these stories ideas is me just asking a question that I want to know the answer to and then trying to find out the answer.
I'll jump in. June, all of us, for the most part, have been, for the past year, give or take, in a couple of weeks, it's going to be about a year, have been trying to do journalism through this pandemic. You've been doing journalism through it. I saw a question in the chat, but it was something I was going to ask myself too, was, what kind of things have you picked up over the course of this last year that might stick with you moving forward, that have changed the way that you report and write on stories, that is just stuff that you're going to continue to carry with you as we hopefully make a return back to what used to be the normal way of covering sports and journalism?
That's a really good question. I have not thought a lot about this. I guess part of that, the reason I haven't thought about this is that like it's been hard to imagine the end of the pandemic, so I've just been like living in this like state of stasis or whatever, as I think we all have in some shape or form. I think the thing that I've personally learned the most from is that the best, the way that I've been able to get people on the phone is to just ask sources or people. If I'm talking to a baseball player for a story, I literally just ask them at the end of the interview, is there anyone else you think would be good for this? Because I know that if I get a recommendation from a baseball player to another baseball player, hey, talk to this reporter, he's got this idea about XYZ, I'm way more likely to get a phone number than if I go through the team PR person. So I think I think the thing that I've felt thankful to have is that I had enough numbers to start off with to build my source network. And I think I've been working on, even if I'm not at the ballpark every single day, which obviously I'm not right now, I'm not talking to these people every day. I've realized that the best way to get people to talk to us for a story is if they have some sort of motivation to talk about it, whether it's self-promotion, political motivation, or just general like interest in a topic, or just having a really good idea, because people are so bored right now and don't want to talk about just day-to-day sports, right? Like just day-to-day, like, hey, what happened at the game? If I come up with like an offbeat sports idea, like I had this story at the beginning of the pandemic about how baseball players are using Twitch. And I realized that people wanted to talk to that story because they wanted to promote their Twitch channels, but also it was talking about like sports video games, and like it wasn't talking about like, should you have thrown a 2-2 fastball against this person in the 8th inning or whatever. And so I think the biggest takeaways has been like, always ask what you don't know at the end of the interview. Like, is there someone you think would be good for this story? Sometimes there's a yes, sometimes there's a no. And also that good ideas can really get people on the phone.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was a really interesting answer. Just the idea of, in a sense, this pandemic has kind of breeded a way where we have more access to people through Zoom and technology. It's easier to get someone on the phone for an interview than it might have been.
Right, because we're all sitting at home.
Yeah, 5 years ago, it's a lot harder. So that's a cool answer. But Destin, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's one that screams to me off the panel was one that came from one of my peers, Jacob Ferry. It was something that I was really thinking about was with the emphasis placed on reporting on social justice movements and social justice issues within sports as it relates to Black Americans and Black athletes. Do you feel that Asian and Asian American athletes are underrepresented and underreported on these issues more so, or what do you think is the deal there, I guess?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. That's a really, really good question. I think, so I think it depends on the person, because I know Asian Americans who are incredibly involved and are incredibly knowledgeable about the social justice movement. I think that, like, I spent a lot of growing up in Boston around mostly white people. I think I had a level of like, ignorance towards a lot of there was a level of ignorance that I had towards racial issues to a certain degree in this country until I got to college, and I kind of got exposed to people of different backgrounds more. I've had a lot of conversations with my friend Master Tesfatzian, who we worked together at the Washington Post and at Bleacher Report about race and what it's like to be Black in America. And I just did a ton of reading about race in America in college, and I realized that all of that reading prepared me to cover the Black Lives Matter movement in the last summer. And also just being, frankly, like one of the only minorities on ESPN's baseball staff, there was not really anyone else who was capable of covering the Black Lives Matter social justice movement in the manner that I was able to. Like, I talked to Tim Anderson about, Lucas Giolito tweeting Black Lives Matter and how their relationship kind of developed, and what it was like for them to talk about race. And there's a lot of baseball writers who are very uncomfortable with talking about race, and don't know where the first place to start is. And I think from the vantage point of a lot of these Black baseball players, to have a reporter who they could talk to who is knowledgeable about the racial justice movement in this country, what it's like to be Black in this country, what it's like to be a minority in this country, it gave them a level of comfort in being willing to open up about their experiences. Like, I talked to Delino DeShields, who was on the Texas Rangers at the time, and he told me a story about being called the getting called the N-word by fans after I forget what exactly the context was, but that was a story that he hadn't, like, he would be a lot harder to talk to a white reporter who doesn't know how to talk about race. Like, there's a lot of anxiety that comes from the player standpoint of, like, what if they misinterpret my words? What if they contextualize the story the wrong way? And so I guess to circle back around to the Asian American thing, it's complicated because I think Asian Americans are still trying to find their place within the racial discussion of America. I think Asian Americans as a whole are off, there's a lot of discussion about the model minority myth among Asian Americans, and how Asian Americans are often used by white people in this country as a tool to put down Black and Hispanic people because of their success in getting into college or having a higher income. And the logical fallacy in all of that is, like, Asian Americans choose to come to the country, right? Like, Black Americans did not choose to come to this country as their ancestors didn't. And so there's just a completely different starting ground that you're starting off with. And so I think Asian Americans as a whole, I think, are still trying to find where they fall within the racial discussions of America. But I think it's a thing that, I hope continues to improve in my lifetime. And I hope that, like, through this, the telling of authentic Asian American stories within mass media, that, like, that discussion continues to happen. But I have no clue whether or not, like, I assume it's going to be a thing with true with, like, any type of progress where there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So, one of my goals in just trying to cover baseball and just cover sports as a whole is to try to provide my vantage point and try to provide my perspective as a minority in this country. But I know that I'm probably going to make mistakes at some point. It's just trying to do my best to help push things forward in a positive direction, I think.
That's a good answer. And I feel like what I'm hearing is, if one of the keys, especially for younger people, I don't mean is to get educated, is to read up a little bit and understand what's going on. I'm not saying old people shouldn't get educated, but you had your chance. Let me just, a really thoughtful question came in from Jason Schulman about writing technique, toggling back and forth here between issues and style. You've got a lovely vocabulary in your, and that's me, not Jason, in your stories. But he says, what advice would you give to up and coming journalists in terms of improving their sports verbiage and the vocabulary in articles without going too over the top and confusing the reader? Noticed you use words like miniaturize, circumvent, precocious in your piece. Do you sit and think of certain words that could replace your basic words, or is that just your flow, from your reading, from your own personal reading?
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly, like, vocabulary is not something I think that hard about. Like, a lot of the times when I'm writing a story, I often feel like I'm just trying to organize the thoughts in my head and just, like, write them down. And my editors are really good at helping me. Like, one of my personal weaknesses in writing is I can get redundant, or I can, like, make often the sentence structure of a sentence can kind of not come together as cleanly as one would like. And I think just generally, like, I have a tendency to, as you guys have probably gotten from this Zoom press conference, like, just talk long. Like, my drafts can come in really, really long, to the point where, like, I would not fault my editors for, resenting me a little bit. And so, again, like, I personally, my goal is to try to write as simply as possible, because, like, at the end of the day, I'm always thinking about my mom or my friend and trying to, like, write the simplest sentence possible. But also, there are circumstances where you need to use a really specific word for a certain set of circumstances. And so, I just try to, I try to think, like, all the time, like, would my mom understand this sentence? Like, if the answer is no, then I try to write it simpler. And that's, I'm always trying to, like, my goal is to always try to make the writing as simple as possible, so it can reach as many people as possible.
I think the vocabulary comes a little bit out of that. Good vocabulary comes a little bit out of the idea that you are trying to be so precise. I genuinely, I think that a lot about your work. So we're 1 minute ahead of 8, so we're getting toward wrap up time. But what I thought was we could all just do, in the panel here, just do one question, and we do like 30-second answer. We do like
Cool.
lightning round, and then we'll wrap. So I'll start. The key to beat development. How do you get the trust in the Red Sox clubhouse?
I think a lot of it had to do with talking about stuff that was not baseball, and just being a person and trying to figure out, like, do I really, like, well, I think a lot of people are maybe just initially distrustful of reporters because they're worried they're going to get screwed over. So trying to, like, show people that, like, you have the best, you're not trying to screw anyone over. You're not trying to, like, seek out attention for yourself, but you have good intentions with, and trying to seek out the truth.
What can Major League Baseball do to have a better presence on social media, and what can teams in particular do you think?
Can I jump in here? Can I
sorry.
jump in here for 1 second?
My bad.
I just want to say, June, you'll appreciate this. I was at an APSE conference with Bud Selig in maybe 2010, and somebody said in the room, and Manfred was there, and one of the reporters says, "What do you think of Twitter?" And Manfred said, "We think it's a fad, and we're not investing in it."
Well, yeah, that, I feel like that sums up a lot of Major League Baseball's problems, is that they need to embrace the internet more, and they need to embrace the multicultural aspect of the game more, because at the end of the day, the thing that I think has held baseball back the last decade is the fact that they've kind of imposed this, like, white MLB traditional culture on the sport. And what makes baseball interesting and different from every other sport in this country is that you have people from all over the world coming together to play a sport, and you should let those cultures really shine, because I think that's what makes baseball special, in my opinion, in this country.
Jumping back to the Instagram story with basketball, a question that I wanted to work in there. Basketball is a sport where highlights are flashy, and it's very easy to highlight stuff like that. Do you see another sport in the high school spectrum kind of jumping on this track and following along with these highlights? Say high school football, it's a very big thing in America, or even, baseball, or more of a worldwide sport like soccer.
Yes, but I think basketball is specifically perfect, tailor-made for the age of the internet because of its flash and the fact that you can see everyone's faces. I think we're going to see more internet stars from, like, football and baseball and soccer. But I think kind of basketball is like the perfect sport for the internet.
Cool. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up with 2 questions. Well, one, I'm just going to ask you if you'll tell the Reggie Jackson story that we talked about before. So
Sure. Yeah.
This is June meeting Reggie Jackson.
Yeah. So I grew up a Red Sox fan, obviously, and so Reggie Jackson. I as a Red Sox fan, you learn a lot about the Yankees and their history as well. And obviously, Reggie Jackson is Mr. October, and just such a legend within baseball. And so one day, I think this was 2019, I was on the field at Yankee Stadium. I was talking to a couple of reporters, and Reggie Jackson kind of emerges from the Yankee dugout. And he knew one of the reporters I was talking to, and they're like, they said hi to Reggie, and they called him over. And, at one point the reporter was like, hey, this is, I introduced myself to Reggie Jackson. I was like, hey, hi, hi, Reggie. My name is June. And he goes, hi, I'm October. And I was like, literally, like, you're literally the only person in the world who could have said that. And like the fact that you were self-aware enough in the moment to say that was so cool. And I ended up
Awesome.
tweeting at the moment, and I think it ended up in like a little mini Sports Illustrated little pullout because the story. I think the editor of Sports Illustrated thought the story was funny, so he decided to put it in there.
That's awesome. I guess my last question, I mean, typically we ask, hey, do you have any parting thoughts, any advice for people? I feel a little bit like your mastery of social media in your reporting, both as an inspiration and using it, might give us something that we might not get from other speakers. So fire away. But anything you want to tell us, anything you want to tell the aspiring journalists out there?
I think the thing that I would want to say is that every opportunity seems to built on each other. So like I did a lot of freelance writing in college, and I started as an intern at the Boston Herald, and like I just slowly networked and made sure to put myself out there. Like as much as I like talking, I tend to kind of be an introvert sometimes and kind of keep to myself, and so I've often forced myself to really put myself out there. And as I've gotten opportunities, I've tried to take as many opportunities as possible that might create another opportunity. And so everything is just kind of built on top of each other. One freelance piece has led to the next one, has helped, an editor for a certain publication has read that piece, so it opened a door there. And then everything is kind of built on each other. And so in that way, I was able to kind of use social media to put myself out there and say hi to reporters and ask people for coffee and, send emails and ask for phone calls. And I spent so much time in college just asking people for advice. Like I had a podcast for the Hardball Times called Doing It for Bartolo, which was an homage to Bartolo Colon. And you can look it up. It's still on iTunes. But I literally used that podcast to just like get to know people I looked up to in the industry better. Like I just interviewed people that I thought were interesting, and I got a sense of their career. I listened to the long form podcast, just thinking about writing all the time, people inside, outside of sports. And so, I mean, I haven't really worked for a news, like I started at the Boston Herald and then I interned for the Washington Post, but most of my writing has been on the internet. Like I have mostly not written ever with a word count in mind or like a column length in mind. And so the internet's such a powerful tool, and it has helped me get connected to so many different people and helped me meet so many different people. So, I think I think like a lot of people, I probably fall in between being an extrovert and introvert, and I sometimes have my introvert tendencies, but being on the internet, I've tried to force myself to be an extrovert and put out my jokes and put out the story ideas that I have, or just reach out to people whose work I admire. And that has been kind of one of the most helpful things that I think I've had in my career, is just trying to utilize the internet to reach as many people as possible.
Awesome. We're really glad you were able to join us, and thank you very much. And we look forward to having you visit in person one day when all this is over. And we're looking forward to the bobblehead story tomorrow. That'll be a blast. June, thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And if anyone on this call wants to reach out, I have my email, my Twitter bio at Joon Lee. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to answer anything you guys have. So
thanks everybody out there. If you're in my classes, we won't see each other Thursday, but we will have quizzes, so you'll see an announcement from me. Thanks everyone.